You cannot light a lantern. You cannot speak above a whisper. Brooklyn, August 29th, 1776. Somewhere ahead of you in the darkness, a man on horseback is counting boats. His name is George Washington, and he does not yet know whether there will be enough. He has perhaps 2 hours of darkness left. Behind him, 9,000 men are still waiting to cross the East River, a stretch of black water the British Navy could seal with a single change of wind. Tonight, you are not watching history from a distance. You are standing in the mud beside him. Across the river, the army that shattered his lines 2 days earlier is camped close enough for sound to carry through the darkness. One sentry wakes. One frightened soldier raises his voice. One oar strikes the side of a boat, and the entire retreat could collapse. Somewhere nearby, an oar enters the water without a sound. The man holding it has spent his life on water like this. He knows exactly how loud a mistake can be. Washington looks toward the boats, then toward the eastern sky. Neither of you knows whether there is enough darkness left. 2 nights earlier, there had been no silence. There had been screaming. On August 27th, more than 20,000 British and Hessian troops struck the American lines on Long Island, the largest battle yet fought in North America. Washington had guarded 3 passes through the high ground protecting Brooklyn. The 4th had been left thinly watched. General Henry Clinton found it in the dark. Before the Americans fully understood what was happening, 10,000 British troops had moved through that pass and appeared behind their lines. The battle was already collapsing. On the American right, a smaller force of Maryland soldiers charged again and again into a British line many times their size. Not to win, to buy time. Time for the rest of the army to escape. More than 200 of them never returned. Washington watched part of the disaster from a rise above the battlefield, close enough to see his own men falling, too far away to reach them. By nightfall, Washington had lost nearly 1,000 men. What remained of his army, close to 9,000, was compressed into a narrow line of earthworks on Brooklyn Heights. The East River was behind them. Howe's army was in front of them. At night, sounds from the British lines could carry through the still air. And Washington knew the truth. This disaster was not only the enemy's doing. He had left the 4th pass thinly guarded. That decision had given Clinton the opening he needed. Now Washington would spend the rest of the night trying to save an army his own choices had helped place in danger. There was only one way out: water, and only a north wind, one no commander could control, was keeping British warships from entering the river and sealing it behind them. Washington understood exactly how little that wind owed him. Then the rain came. It fell through most of the next day, filling the trenches and soaking men who were already exhausted. Gunpowder was ruined. Uniforms clung to skin. There were no dry tents. No fires could be lit without risking detection. Washington later told Congress that the weather had exhausted his men almost as much as the battle itself. Around him, soldiers were no longer discussing courage or surrender. They were doing arithmetic. 9,000 men. An enemy nearly 3 times that size. A river at their backs. And Washington himself had barely slept in 2 days. He moved on horseback between the lines, watching the British positions, waiting for the assault everyone believed was coming. For the moment, the weather was holding it back. But the weather would not protect them forever. Washington understood one thing clearly. The wind was not going to save them on its own. Someone would have to move 9,000 men, along with their horses, artillery, ammunition, and supplies, across nearly a mile of open water, at night, in silence. And before the eastern sky began to brighten, his generals told him the truth plainly. The lines would not survive a full British assault. That afternoon, they met in council. By the time they rose, the decision had been made. The army would leave Brooklyn that night. But Washington could not tell his men. Not yet. The regiments were told that fresh troops were arriving to relieve them. Most soldiers believed they were preparing for another movement against the British. Many would not understand that they were retreating until they reached the boats. Because if the truth spread too early, fear could destroy the operation before the enemy ever discovered it. Men might abandon their positions, crowd the landing, fight for space in the boats. Discipline could collapse without a single British shot being fired. Secrecy was no longer caution. It was survival. Now Washington needed boats, not warships. Anything that could float. Rowboats, flat-bottomed scows, sloops taken from private docks. Every usable vessel was ordered to the river before dark, and the men chosen to operate them were not ordinary soldiers. They were fishermen and sailors from Marblehead, Massachusetts, commanded by Colonel John Glover. These men had spent their lives reading tides, currents, and changing wind. They had crossed dangerous water in darkness before, but never with an army waiting behind them, and never with so much depending on every trip. The boats had arrived, but the river would not cooperate. The tide was running against them, and the same wind that had kept the British fleet away now turned against the Americans. Only the smallest boats could make real progress. The larger sloops, the vessels capable of carrying the most men, sat almost useless at the shore. For nearly 2 hours, Washington stood at the landing and watched the boats fight the current. Some barely moved. Every failed crossing consumed minutes he could never recover. Behind him, officers moved through the waiting ranks, repeating the same orders. No talking, no coughing, nothing allowed to strike against wood. One overloaded boat could create panic. One careless movement could carry across the water. One mistake could expose the entire operation, and there was no way to remove that risk completely. Thousands of men waited in the darkness behind Washington, listening for movement from the British side. The boats were moving, but not fast enough. You cannot yet tell whether the plan has begun to work or whether it is already failing. Neither can Washington. Then, close to 11 o'clock, the wind died. No warning, no gradual change. One moment, the river was fighting them. The next, it went still. A few minutes later, the wind returned from the opposite direction. Soft, steady, exactly what the boats needed. According to accounts written that week, the river became flat as glass. The sloops raised their sails. The crossing accelerated. The wind had changed. Time had not. Washington stopped counting minutes. He began counting trips, because the hours already lost were gone forever. And however quickly the boats moved now, dawn was still coming. Then another problem began. Word had spread through the ranks. This was not an attack. It was a retreat, and the men waiting in the darkness understood what that meant. Anyone left behind on that shore could be captured or killed. The line at the landing began to tighten, then to bend, then to break. Men pushed forward. Some tried to force their way into boats already riding dangerously low in the water. According to one later account, Washington personally intervened when an overloaded boat came close to swamping. The exact details remain uncertain, but the danger was real. One boat going under could have triggered panic across the entire landing. For a few moments, order hung by a thread. Then the line held. Barely. And the boats kept moving. For the first time that night, the crossing looked as if it might actually work. And that was when a single mistake nearly destroyed everything. An aide moved through the darkness carrying orders to the rear guard. Somewhere along the way, the message changed. The men holding the final defensive line were told to withdraw, so they did. The trenches emptied. The last barrier between the British Army and the ferry landing simply disappeared into the night. The soldiers believed the evacuation was almost complete. It was not. Thousands of men were still waiting near the water. When Washington saw the rear guard arriving at the landing far too early, he immediately understood what had happened. The positions behind them were open. The British were close, and there was now nothing between the enemy and an army still trapped along the shoreline. Witnesses later remembered Washington calling it a dreadful mistake. With confusion already spreading around the boats, a British advance at that moment could have turned the landing into a killing ground. There was no time for blame. The rear guard turned around. They marched back through the darkness, back toward the trenches they had just abandoned. The British had not noticed. Not yet. The defensive line was restored before anyone across the field understood that, for a few critical minutes, It had not existed at all. But the mistake had consumed something Washington could not replace: time. Dawn was approaching. Thousands of men were still on the Brooklyn side, holding positions designed only to create the illusion that the army remained in place. The darkness was beginning to thin. Washington could now distinguish the shapes of men who had been invisible an hour earlier. Then, in the final hour before sunrise, British troops moved forward to test the American positions. They found empty trenches. The British had discovered the retreat. The last boats had not yet left. And then, for reasons no surviving account fully explains, nothing happened. No immediate alarm. No sudden rush toward the landing. No pursuit crashing through the abandoned lines. Whatever the patrol had seen, and however quickly the warning moved through the British camp, it did not travel fast enough. Not yet. The distance between discovery and disaster had collapsed from hours to minutes. Then something happened that no order, no plan, and no council of war had prepared for. As the sky continued to brighten, fog began rising from the river. At first, it softened the shoreline. Then it thickened. One officer later remembered that a man could disappear only a few yards away. The soldiers nearest the water vanished first. Then the boats. Then Washington himself became little more than a shape in the gray. No one knew how long it would last. No one knew whether it would lift before the final boat reached Manhattan. And no one had ordered it. Under that cover, the rear guard finally abandoned the trenches and moved toward the ferry. The men who had spent the night pretending the army was still there now ran through the fog toward the water. One officer even returned for a horse left near the landing and came back under British fire, a final measure of how close the retreat had come to discovery. Through all of it, Washington remained at the ferry, watching the last men arrive, watching the final boats load, refusing to leave while soldiers were still behind him. And according to more than one account, he was among the last men to step away from the Brooklyn shore. Within minutes, the fog began to lift. British soldiers moved into the positions they had spent 2 days preparing to destroy. They found abandoned tents, dying fires, empty trenches, and beyond them, an empty shoreline. No army left to capture, no commander left to take. In a single night, nearly 9,000 men had crossed a mile of open water, along with their horses, their field guns, their ammunition, their wounded, all beneath the reach of the most powerful navy in the world. The entire operation had cost them only a handful of stragglers who stayed behind to loot the abandoned camp, and several heavy cannon left trapped in the mud. Everyone else escaped. Not because the plan had gone perfectly. It had nearly failed again and again. The wind had fought them. The current had delayed them. Fear had threatened to break the line. One mistaken order had left the entire waterfront exposed. But Washington refused to abandon the army. And exhausted soldiers, officers, sailors, and boat crews held the operation together through every hour it threatened to collapse. The final boats reached Manhattan. The Brooklyn shore disappeared behind them. The army survived, and Washington survived with it. 2 days later, when the river was behind him and the army was finally safe, Washington sat down to write to Congress. Only then did he admit what the night had cost him. For the previous 48 hours, he wrote, he had hardly been off his horse, and had never once closed his eyes. He would face colder nights before the war was over, bloodier battles, larger victories, but perhaps never again would so much depend on so few remaining hours of darkness. He had not defeated Howe. He had not erased the mistakes that trapped his army on Brooklyn Heights. He had not won the battle. What he had done was preserve the one thing the revolution could not survive without: its army. 4 months later, on a far colder night, many of those same men crossed another river in darkness. This time, they were not retreating. They were moving toward a town called Trenton, toward the victory that would help keep the revolution alive. But none of that could have happened if the army had disappeared on the Brooklyn shore. Washington did not win that night. He refused to lose the army. If you want to walk beside another commander on the night his war nearly ended before it began, subscribe to Reconstructed World. Witness.